They didn't even wait for me to get home before they started tearing it apart. The first thing that hit me wasn't the noise. It was the smell. Sweet, sharp, unmistakable. Crushed blueberries baking under the Texas sun, mixed with diesel fumes and hot metal. I rounded the bend of my gravel road and saw it. Two yellow machines parked right in the middle of my field. Tires sunk deep into soil my grandfather had spent 40 years building by hand. The air felt wrong, like something sacred had been disturbed. My boots crunched over gravel as I stepped out of the truck, keys still in the ignition, heart steady but heavy. Rows of bushes that should have been waist-high and full were flattened into dark stains across the dirt, purple juice bleeding into the earth like it was trying to hold on. A man in a reflective vest glanced at me, then looked away like I didn't belong there. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was planned. Community parking expansion, the sign said, staked into the ground where my irrigation line used to run. Clean white letters, professionally printed, like they'd been waiting for this day. I could still hear the low idle of the engine, that deep mechanical hum vibrating through the soles of my boots. No one asked. No one called. They just showed up and started taking. My name is Ethan Caldwell. This land, 15 acres just outside a quiet subdivision in central Texas, has been in my family since 1958. My grandfather planted the first blueberry bushes here with his bare hands, back when this was nothing but dry pasture and stubborn clay. He used to say blueberries don't grow where they're told. They grow where the soil is respected. Every row out there followed the curve of the land. Every plant spaced just right for sunlight and drainage. I learned to measure rainfall before I could drive. Learned how to read the leaves for signs of stress. Learned that good soil takes patience and time you can't rush. And now I was standing there watching tire tracks cut straight through decades of that work like it was just empty dirt. That's when I saw her, Diane Whitmore, standing at the edge of the field in a pressed white blouse and sunglasses that reflected everything except accountability. She held a clipboard like it was a badge, tapping it lightly against her palm as she walked toward me, heels somehow clean despite the mess around her. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "We've been trying to reach you." I looked past her, at the machines, at the sign, at the workers pretending not to listen. "You're on my land," I said. Simple. Direct. The kind of statement that shouldn't need explanation. Her smile didn't move. "This area has been rezoned for community use," she replied, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "Parking demand has increased significantly, and the HOA board voted unanimously." The word rezoned hung in the air longer than it should have. I felt the heat on the back of my neck, the faint stickiness of crushed fruit under my boots, the distant hum of insects that hadn't realized their world had just been rearranged. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, taking it in, letting every detail settle exactly where it needed to. Because something about this didn't add up. And if there's one thing farming teaches you, it's this. When something looks wrong on the surface, you don't panic. You dig deeper. I bent down and picked up a handful of soil where one of the bushes used to be, letting it run slowly through my fingers, darker than it should have been, damp in a way that did not come from rain, but from crushed fruit and broken roots. And for a second, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my mind telling me to pay attention to what the land was trying to say, because soil always tells the truth if you know how to listen. And right now it was telling me something had been forced, rushed, pushed through without care, without understanding, without respect, and that alone was enough to know this was not going to end the way Diane thought it would. Because land like this does not just get taken quietly, not when it has history buried in every inch of it, not when it has been documented, measured, maintained, and protected for decades longer than any of those houses behind me had even existed. I stood up, slowly, and looked out across what was left of the rows, trying to picture them the way they were just a week ago, evenly spaced lines stretching across 15 acres, each bush trimmed to the same height. Each irrigation line running clean and precise, every inch accounted for. I knew every corner of this place the way some people know the layout of their own homes. I knew where the soil held moisture longer after a storm, where the sun hit hardest in late July, where the berries ripened first, and where they needed another few days. This was not just land to me. It was a system, a living one, and systems leave records whether people realize it or not. Diane's heels clicked lightly on a piece of broken irrigation pipe as she shifted her weight, glancing around like she was inspecting a finished project instead of the damage that had just been done. "We followed all proper procedures," she said, tapping her clipboard again. That same controlled tone, the kind that tries to close a conversation before it even starts. "You should have received notice weeks ago." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not the polished version she presented at HOA meetings or neighborhood gatherings, but the person underneath that confidence, the one who believed paperwork could overwrite reality. "I receive a lot of mail," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I do not remember anything about giving up my field." She smiled again, thinner this time, like she was used to resistance but not concerned by it. "It was not about giving it up. It was about community improvement," she replied. And that word community landed heavier than anything else she had said so far, because I knew exactly what she meant by it. I had seen it before, seen how quickly people redefine ownership when they think they have enough votes or enough signatures or enough pressure behind them. I turned and walked a few steps toward one of the remaining rows that had not been touched yet, running my hand lightly across the leaves, still cool from the morning air, still intact, still doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And that is when I noticed something that made me pause. Not the damage, not the machines, but something older, something small and almost forgotten, just beyond the edge of the field near the fence line, half covered in tall grass, a weathered wooden post with a metal plate bolted into it, faded lettering barely visible under years of sun and rain. I stepped closer, brushing away the grass with my boot, leaning down until I could read it. And there it was, still intact after all this time. The same marker my grandfather had pointed out to me when I was a kid, the one he told me never to remove, never to ignore, because it mattered more than anything else on this land. The words were worn but clear enough once you knew what you were looking for. United States Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Program. Established 1987. I could feel something shift in my chest. Not anger, not panic, something steadier than that, something colder, more precise. Because suddenly the noise of the machines, the smell of diesel, the clipboard in Diane's hand, all of it felt smaller, like pieces of a plan that had missed a detail that should have been obvious. I straightened up slowly, dusting the dirt off my hands. And for the first time since I pulled up that morning, I stopped looking at what they were doing and started thinking about what they had overlooked. I did not say another word to Diane after that. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already heard enough. And more importantly, I had seen enough. That small metal plate by the fence line stayed in my mind like a fixed point, steady and unmoving while everything else around it felt rushed and careless. I walked back toward my truck slowly, each step deliberate, gravel shifting under my boots, the hum of the machines fading behind me. And for the first time since I arrived, I let them keep working. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone who thinks they are winning is let them continue without interruption. Let them commit fully to the mistake they do not even realize they are making. I reached into the cab and pulled out the old binder I kept behind the seat. Worn edges, pages thick with years of records, receipts, inspection reports, handwritten notes from seasons long past. The kind of documentation most people would not bother keeping, but my grandfather insisted on. He used to say paper is quieter than people, but it lasts longer and it does not forget. I flipped through it right there with the engine still running, the faint smell of gasoline mixing with the sweetness still hanging in the air, page after page until I found what I was looking for. The original enrollment documents from 1987, the same year stamped on. That metal plate, signatures, federal letterhead, soil classification reports, conservation agreements, every detail laid out in plain language that had nothing to do with neighborhood boards or local zoning shortcuts. I could feel the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly as the pieces started lining up, not because the situation was resolved, but because it finally made sense. Diane had been operating on a level she understood, local votes, HOA authority, paperwork that looked official. Enough to convince anyone who did not know better, but she had stepped into something older than that, something that did not answer to her board or her community meetings. I closed the binder and looked back out at the field, watching one of the workers reposition a machine near the untouched rows. They were moving deeper now, expanding the damage with the same confidence they had when they first arrived. And I realized that confidence was exactly what I needed, because it meant they would not stop on their own. They would not question the boundary they were crossing. They would keep going until someone with the right authority told them otherwise. And that was not going to come from me standing there arguing on the edge of the field. It was going to come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that did not care about parking demand or property values or how many cars the neighborhood needed space for. I stepped out of the truck again and walked back toward Diane, who was now speaking with one of the crew members, pointing toward the far end of the property like she was mapping out the future. "You should probably take a look at your paperwork again," I said, my voice calm, steady, not raised, just enough to make her turn. She adjusted her sunglasses slightly, studying me like she was trying to figure out why I was not reacting the way she expected. "Everything has been reviewed and approved," she replied, that same rehearsed confidence. But there was a small pause this time, almost unnoticeable, the kind of hesitation that slips in when certainty is not as solid as it appears. I nodded once, not arguing, not pushing, just letting the moment sit exactly where it was. Because I did not need to convince her, not anymore. I had already seen what she had missed, and now it was just a matter of time before someone else saw it too. Someone who would not ask for her approval or her explanation. Someone who would not care how many meetings she had held or how many votes she had counted. I turned back toward my truck, pulling out my phone as I walked, the screen lighting up in my hand. And for a brief second I could hear my grandfather again, not as a memory this time but as a reminder. Measure twice, act once. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I had not used in years, a regional office tied to a program most people around here had probably never even heard of. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ring on the other end, while behind me the machines kept moving forward, unaware that every second they continued was not helping Diane's plan. It was sealing it. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the steady ring while the sound of engines behind me blended into a low mechanical rhythm, the kind that feels constant until it suddenly stops. "United States Department of Agriculture, Regional Office," a calm voice answered, professional, unhurried. And I could tell immediately this was not someone who reacted to panic. This was someone who dealt in facts. "My name is Ethan Caldwell," I said, pacing slowly along the edge of the field, eyes tracking every movement of those machines. "I am calling about an active disturbance on land enrolled in the Soil Conservation Program, established 1987, Caldwell property, 15 acres, Travis County." There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that tells you someone is already pulling up records before they even respond. "Can you describe the nature of the disturbance?" the voice asked, still steady, still neutral, and I could hear faint keyboard clicks in the background. I looked out at the sign again, at the workers moving deeper into rows that had no idea they were protected by something none of them had checked. Heavy equipment operating without federal clearance, land being altered for non-agricultural use. No prior notification to the enrolled owner. I said, keeping it simple, keeping it precise, because details matter more than emotion in moments like this. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then a shift in tone, subtle but real. "Stay on site. Mr. Caldwell, do not interfere directly. We are flagging this for immediate review." Immediate, that word landed differently, heavier than anything Diane had said all morning. I ended the call without another word and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Then I turned and walked back toward the field, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. Because now it was not about stopping them myself. It was about letting the right people see exactly what was happening. Diane noticed me returning and adjusted her posture, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the kind of stance people take when they believe control is still theirs. "I assume you have had time to process the situation," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the crew nearby to hear, like she wanted an audience for whatever response I gave. I stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the reflection of the field in her sunglasses, distorted rows and broken lines. "I have," I replied, and left it at that. No argument, no explanation, just a statement. Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second, barely visible, but it was there. That small crack in certainty that only shows when someone expects resistance and gets something else entirely. Something quieter, something harder to read. She turned back toward the crew and gestured toward the far end again. "Continue through that section. We need the entire area cleared by end of day," she said, confident. Again, louder now, reinforcing the authority she believed she held. The machine operator nodded and shifted position, the engine revving slightly as the equipment moved forward, cutting a wider path, and I watched it happen without stepping in, without raising a hand, because stopping it now would have changed nothing. The real line had already been crossed, and every foot they moved past that marker by the fence line only made it clearer. I walked along the perimeter, taking in every detail. The position of the sign, the path of the machines, the untouched rows that still stood like witnesses waiting their turn, the sky above clear and indifferent, the kind of Texas afternoon that makes everything feel slower than it actually is. And then I noticed something else. A county truck slowing down on the road just beyond the property line. The driver glancing over, taking in the activity, not stopping, just observing. And it reminded me how visible this had become, how many eyes might. Near the fence line where that old marker stood, one hand resting lightly against the weathered wood, feeling the rough grain under my palm, grounding myself in something that had been here longer than any of this, longer than her board, longer than those houses, longer than the idea that this land could be repurposed because someone decided it should be. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the county road again, this time stopping for a moment before continuing on, the driver watching a little. Longer than before. And I could feel it. That quiet shift when something stops being just a private dispute and starts becoming visible, starts becoming something others notice even if they do not understand it yet. Diane's voice carried again, sharper now. "We are losing daylight. Keep it moving," she called out. And there was a slight edge to it this time, a hint of urgency that had not been there earlier. Like she wanted this finished before anything could interrupt it, before anyone could question it. And that told me she understood more than she was letting on, not everything, but enough to feel the need to push forward faster. I pulled my phone out again, not to call, just to check the time, each minute passing quietly, steadily, and I thought about everything that had led up to this, the meetings I had never attended because I trusted my land to speak for itself, the letters I had likely skimmed without realizing what they were building toward, the assumption that something this obvious would not be challenged. And I realized that was the real difference between Diane and me. She operated on momentum, on pressure, on moving fast enough that no one could slow her down, and I operated on patience, on records, on details that did not change just because someone decided they should. A gust of wind moved across the field, lifting a few loose leaves, carrying the faint scent of soil and something metallic from the machines, and for a second everything felt suspended. Like the land itself was holding its breath. I heard it before I saw it, a different kind of engine, lower, heavier, not rushed, coming from the direction of the main road. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the movement at the edge of the property, a white government vehicle easing onto the gravel, slow, deliberate, no lights, no noise beyond the steady hum of its engine, and it did not stop at the road. It continued forward, tires crunching over gravel, heading straight toward the field, toward the sign, toward the machines that were still moving like nothing had changed. Diane noticed it a second later, her posture shifting almost instantly, shoulders tightening, clipboard lowering just slightly as she tracked the vehicle's approach. And for the first time since this started, she did not speak, she did not direct, she just watched, trying to read something she could not control. The truck came to a stop near the edge of the disturbed rows, engine idling, dust settling slowly around it. The door opened, and a man stepped out, plain shirt, official badge clipped at his belt, eyes already scanning the ground before he even took a full step forward, and I stayed where I was, one hand still resting on that old marker, watching the moment settle into place exactly the way I knew it would, because this was never about who could argue louder or move faster. It was about who understood the ground they were standing on, and right now, that understanding was about to shift completely. The man did not rush, and that was the first thing that told me everything I needed to know. He stepped forward with a measured pace, boots pressing lightly into the disturbed soil as his eyes moved across the field, not just looking but reading it, the way someone trained to notice patterns reads a scene without needing anyone to explain it. He paused near the edge of a freshly cleared section and crouched slightly, running his fingers through the soil the same way I had earlier, then lifting them to inspect the residue. His expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, like he had already found what he was looking for. Diane recovered quickly, straightening her posture and stepping forward to meet him, that polished smile returning. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" she said, voice smooth, controlled, but just a shade tighter than before. The man stood and reached calmly to his belt, flashing his identification just long enough to make it clear, "Federal Soil Conservation Compliance," he said, his tone even, not loud, not aggressive, just definitive, and something about the way he said it cut through the air more effectively than any raised voice could have. The machines behind him continued for a few seconds longer, the operators unaware or unsure, until he lifted one hand slightly without even turning around. A simple gesture, and one by one the engines began to idle down, the sound fading into a quiet that felt heavier than the noise had been. Diane's smile held, but it was fixed now, no longer natural. "We have all necessary approvals for this development," she said, tapping her clipboard again like it could reinforce her position. The man glanced at the sign, then at the flattened rows, then toward the fence line where the old markers stood, and I could see the moment he connected it all, his gaze lingering just long enough on that metal plate before returning to her. "This property is enrolled under a federal conservation agreement established in 1987, he said, still calm, still precise. "Any alteration of soil structure or agricultural use requires federal review and authorization." Diane shifted her weight slightly, the first real sign of discomfort breaking through. "We received zoning approval from the county," she replied. And now there was a subtle emphasis on the word county, like she was reaching for a level of authority that no longer carried the same weight. The man nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "Local zoning does not override federal conservation restrictions," he said, and there was no edge in his voice, no accusation, just a fact placed exactly where it needed to be. I stayed where I was, near the fence line, watching the exchange without stepping in, because this was not my conversation anymore. This was between someone who thought authority could be declared and someone who understood where it actually came from. The man took a few steps deeper into the field, scanning the extent of the disturbance, noting the equipment, the cleared sections, the remaining rows, every detail being silently recorded. Diane followed a half step behind, still trying to maintain control of the situation. "If there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it quickly," she said. And now there was a hint of urgency beneath the polished tone. The man stopped and turned slightly toward her. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said, and for the first time there was a slight shift in his voice. Not louder, not harsher, but firmer, anchored in something that did not need to be negotiated. "This is a violation under federal conservation statutes, and it is being documented as such." The word violation seemed to settle over the field like a weight, heavier than any machine that had been there earlier. Diane's grip tightened on her clipboard, her knuckles paling just slightly, and she glanced briefly at the workers, at the machines now sitting still, at the sign that had looked so official just an hour ago. And in that moment the balance shifted. Completely, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more final, the quiet certainty of a rule she had never checked colliding with the land. She thought she could take the silence after that word lingered longer than anything else that had been said all day. Even the wind seemed to ease off, like the field itself was listening. The federal officer did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself. He simply pulled a small notepad from his pocket and began writing, slow, deliberate. Each stroke of his pen marking something that was no longer theoretical, no longer something Diane could smooth over with a meeting or a vote. This was being recorded in a system that did not forget and did not negotiate. Diane stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice now, trying to contain the situation. "There must be a way to correct this without escalating," she said, and that word correct sounded different coming from her. Less confident, more cautious. The officer did not stop writing. "Correction begins with cessation," he replied, still calm, still precise. "All activity stops immediately, and documentation of damage will be submitted for federal review." Behind him, one of the machine operators shut off his engine completely, the final click echoing faintly, and the rest followed, one by one, until the entire field was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on the county road. I could see the workers stepping back, uncertain, looking toward Diane for direction that no longer carried the same weight it had an hour ago. She glanced at them, then back at the officer, calculating, adjusting. But every move felt slower now, like she was operating in a space where the rules had changed without her realizing it. The officer moved toward the sign planted in the ground, reading it briefly before making another note. Then he turned and walked toward the fence line, toward that old marker half hidden in the grass, and when he reached it, he brushed the surface lightly with his hand, clearing away the dust just enough to make the lettering visible again. He nodded once to himself, as if confirming something already known, then turned back toward the field. This marker indicates active federal enrollment, he said, not to me, not specifically to Diane, but to the situation itself, placing the fact exactly where it belonged. Diane's posture shifted again, her shoulders no longer squared, her clipboard now held closer to her side instead of out in front. We relied on county zoning approval, she repeated, but this time the statement sounded smaller, like it had lost its foundation. The officer met her gaze for a moment, not confrontational, just steady. Reliance on incomplete authority does not negate federal jurisdiction, he said, and there was something final in that sentence, something that closed the gap between assumption and reality. I stayed where I was, watching it all unfold with a kind of quiet clarity, because this was the part most people never see, not the argument, not the conflict, but the shift, the moment when one system quietly overrides another without needing to raise its voice. The officer stepped back toward his vehicle and spoke briefly into a handheld radio, low enough that I could not hear the words, but I could see the response in the way he nodded once, acknowledging whatever came through on the other end. Then he turned back toward Diane. A formal notice will be issued, and further action will depend on compliance and remediation, he said, and that word remediation hung in the air with a weight Diane had not planned for, because remediation meant undoing, meant accountability, meant that what had been done here could not simply be left behind as progress. It had to be addressed, corrected, possibly reversed. Diane looked out over the field, at the flattened rows, the disturbed soil, the machines now sitting idle, and for the first time since this started, she did not speak immediately. She just looked, taking in the scope of something that was no longer under her control, and I could see it then, not panic, not anger, but realization, slow and unavoidable, settling in as the afternoon light stretched across the land she thought she could take, and now had to answer for. The field did not change all at once. It shifted in small, quiet ways that added up to something irreversible. The machines stayed still, their engines cooling with faint ticking sounds that replaced the earlier noise. The workers gathered in loose clusters near the edge of the property, speaking in low voices, no longer looking to Diane for direction, but instead glancing toward the federal officer as if waiting for permission to move at all. The sign that had once looked official now stood alone in the dirt, its clean white surface almost out of place against the broken rows and dark soil around it. The officer walked the length of the disturbed area again, slower this time, documenting everything with a small camera pulled from his vehicle. Each click deliberate, capturing angles, distances, the position of equipment, the extent of impact. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked, because this was no longer about what had been planned. It was about what had actually been done. Diane followed at a distance now, not leading, not directing, just observing the process unfold in a way she could not interrupt. Her clipboard still in hand, but no longer used, just held, like a prop from a role that had already ended. I stepped away from the fence line for the first time since the officer arrived, walking carefully across the edge of the field where the soil was still intact, avoiding the crushed sections out of habit more than necessity. And as I moved closer, I could see the details more clearly, the way the roots had been exposed, the way the irrigation lines had been bent out of place, the pattern of tire tracks cutting across rows that had taken years to establish. And for a moment, there was a weight in my chest, not anger, not even frustration, just the recognition of time lost, of work undone, but it did not stay there long, because right behind it was something steadier, something grounded in the knowledge that this was not the end of the story. The officer paused near me, glancing briefly in my direction before returning his attention to the field. You maintained enrollment continuously, he said, more as confirmation than question. I nodded once. Every year, I replied, and that was all that needed to be said. He made another note, then looked back across the property, taking in the full scope one more time. Diane finally stepped closer again, her voice lower now, more measured. "What happens next?" she asked, and there was no attempt to control the situation in her tone anymore, just a direct question. The officer closed his notebook and met her gaze. "Immediate cessation has been established," he said. "A formal violation report will be filed, and the property will be subject to federal review for restoration requirements and potential penalties." The word penalties seemed to settle heavier than anything else, because it carried implications beyond this field, beyond today. It reached into whatever structure she had built around herself and her authority. Diane looked down briefly at the ground, then back up, processing, calculating. But this time there was no quick response, no confident explanation ready to fill the space, just silence, the kind that follows when options narrow faster than expected. The officer turned back toward his vehicle, speaking again into his radio, his voice still calm, still controlled, coordinating whatever came next without urgency, because urgency was not needed when the outcome was already set in motion. I stood there, looking out across the field, at the rows that remained, at the sections that would need time to recover, at the sign that no longer meant anything in the face of what had just been established, and I realized something simple, something my grandfather had always understood without needing to say it out loud. Land does not argue. It does not defend itself. It just holds the truth of what it is, and sooner or later, that truth finds its way to the surface, no matter who tries to cover it up or reshape it. And today, it had done exactly that, not through noise, not through force, but through something far more reliable, something written long before any of us were standing here, something Diane had never bothered to look for, and now could not ignore. By the time the sun started to dip lower over the field, the entire place felt different, not quieter in sound but quieter in meaning. The kind of silence that comes after something has been settled without needing to be argued again. The federal vehicle was still parked near the edge of the property, its presence steady and unhurried, while the machines that had once moved with confidence now sat untouched, their operators leaning against them or standing nearby with hands in their pockets, waiting for instructions that were not coming from Diane anymore. She stood a few yards away from the sign, looking at it like she was seeing it for the first time, the clean lettering now just plastic and ink without authority behind it. Her clipboard lowered completely at her side, no longer tapped, no longer referenced, just held loosely as if she had not decided where to put it down yet. I walked slowly along one of the remaining rows, running my hand across the leaves again, feeling the texture, checking what was still intact, what could recover, what would need time, because that was the thing about land like this. It does not disappear just because it is disturbed. It holds on, it rebuilds, but it does it on its own timeline, not anyone else's. The officer approached me once more, stopping a few feet away. "You will receive formal documentation within the week," he said, his tone unchanged, still calm, still precise. "Restoration guidelines will be included, along with next steps for compliance and oversight." I nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant, not just for me, but for everything that had happened here today, because oversight does not just end when the machines stop. It continues, it follows through, it ensures that what was broken is addressed properly. Diane stepped closer then, slower than before, her voice measured, stripped of the confidence it had carried earlier. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and there was a pause after my name, like she was choosing her words more carefully now. "We were acting in what we believed was the best interest of the community." I looked at her for a moment, really looked this time, not at the authority she tried to project, but at the shift that had taken place, the realization settling in behind her eyes. The land does not change based on belief, I said, my voice steady, not raised, just clear, and that was all that needed to be said, because this was never about intention. It was about understanding, and that was the part she had missed from the beginning. She nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like she finally understood the difference. The officer closed his notebook and returned to his vehicle, the door shutting with a solid, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something larger than just the day. The workers began to disperse shortly after. Equipment left in place, no longer tools of progress, but reminders of a line that had been crossed and then corrected. The sign was removed before the last truck pulled away, lifted out of the ground and set aside without ceremony. leaving behind a patch of disturbed soil where it had stood. And as the dust settled and the vehicles disappeared down the road, the field remained, changed but still there, still mine, still holding everything it had always held beneath the surface. I stood near the fence line one last time, resting my hand against that old marker, the metal plate warm from the afternoon sun, its lettering still faint but unmistakable, a quiet piece of proof that had outlasted everything else. And I thought about how close it had come to being ignored, to being overlooked, to being just another detail in a landscape someone thought they understood. But that is the thing about details. The right one at the right time does not need to be loud. It just needs to exist, and when it does, it has a way of bringing everything else back into place, one step at a time, until the truth is no longer something you have to argue for. It is simply what remains when everything else falls away.